Thank you. For those here in the room, if you have never heard the jingle written originally by Van Ambrose, take a listen at agendaalexandria.org. For any of our programs in the past, it started out as the music for the podcast and then became the soundtrack for all of our regular programs. So with that, good evening, everyone. And I'm Ricardo Alfaro. I am your outgoing co-chair of Agenda Alexandria, along with Michael Pope. And as I close out my time as co-chair of Agenda Alexandria, I want to take a moment to reflect, not just on what we've accomplished, but really on the challenges that lie ahead. And it's no secret that we are living in challenging times. The city of Alexandria, like much of the country, finds itself navigating increasingly polarized conversations. Even within our community, one known for its civic pride and engagement, we've seen growing tendency to shout over one another, to accuse instead of listen, and to label instead of learn. And yes, we've had programs, if you've attended programs in the past, where we've had audience members standing up and yelling. We've had panelists publicly accused of lying, not disagreed with, but called liars. And frankly, the erosion of civil discourse is a threat, not just to this organization, but to the very fabric of how we live together in this city. But that is exactly why Agenda Alexandria matters now more than ever. We don't exist to fuel outrage. We're not here to score political points. And our mission is simple but essential: to look at the issues without taking sides. We convene, we question, we listen, we learn. And we do it in public, in community, and hopefully with respect. So while I may be stepping down, I do so with great pride in the work that we've done and unwavering faith in the work to come. Because in the end, our agenda has never been partisan or personal. The only agenda is Alexandria. So with that, let's now talk about elections. First, let's start with elections of Agenda Alexandria. So most of you that have been attending these events, even prior to the pandemic, know that we have this. It became kind of like a tradition, like a ceremonial thing, but it's actually really important. If you have paid your membership dues, and I'm assuming everyone here, for the purposes of this, everyone has here, you all ratify the incoming board. So pursuant to the process outlined in our bylaws, I move to ratify the election of the incoming board of directors of Agenda Alexandria for the upcoming term as follows: Steve Davidson for chair, Linda App for vice chair, Jennifer Roback for secretary, Beth Seltzer for treasurer, Jacqueline Bridges as board member, Rod Kukrow as board member, Connie Hart as board member, Jeannie Franco as board member, Mary Watland as board member, Dan Brandel as board member, and Amy Jackson as board member. Is there a second? Second. Seconded by Mary. Any discussion? Okay, hearing none. All those in favor of ratifying the proposed slate of officers and board members, please say aye. Aye. All those opposed, say no. Okay, the motion carries. Congratulations to the new board. I look forward to supporting you in this next chapter. And now with that, I'll hand it over to Michael Pope for tonight's program, Elections in Alexandria.
Can we get some applause for our former president and chairman, Ricardo Alfaro? He's very excited to be former. I see we've got some former chairs of agenda in the audience. Thank you for joining us. Our registrar of voting is here. I mean, this is a crowd. This is a great crowd. In case you don't know our new president, he's sitting over there. So wave, this is our new president here. So if you have any problems with anything tonight, don't hit up me because I can't help you anymore. It's this guy. It's his concern now. All right. I am going to introduce our panelists really quick, and we'll get right into it. First up is this guy right next to me on stage left to your right. He is a friend of mine because we know each other through the Alexandria Historical Society. So Scott Varick, give him a hand. He's going to talk about the history of elections in Virginia. We also have the executive director in the middle here, the executive director of Upvote, Liz White. Thanks for joining us. We have ranked choice supporters in the audience, I see. Okay, all right. The Upvote crowd, I like it. We are really pleased to be joined by my friend, longtime columnist for the Richmond Times-Dispatch, who is now politics analyst. Don't call him political analyst because he's politics analyst. Jeff Shapiro is joining us. All right, so this is a little bit of a buffet here of different kinds of things that we're going to talk about here, but I guarantee you it's going to be a fun time. If you have any questions, and I'm positive that you will, you can write them down on the 3x5 index cards, and we will have people circling around to first of all, give you a card, allow you to write your questions, and they'll be circling around, grabbing the cards and bringing them up to me, so if you have any questions, but I've got all my own questions I want to ask. Scott Varick, I'm going to start with you. Let's go way back in the mists of time here to the earliest elections in Alexandria. There's one part of how elections worked back then that is just fascinating to the modern view, which is in order to get elected, people in the old days would liquor up the voters. They would literally bring all kinds of rum and wine and explain this phenomenon, swilling the planters with bumbo.
Absolutely. Thank you, Michael. So the best way to understand it is that the earliest elections in Alexandria's history, compared with today, the act of voting was a much more public activity, but how much of the public could participate was much more limited. So in the 18th century, the only people who were allowed to vote under the law were white men over the age of 21 who met certain property requirements. Anybody else was barred from voting. And rather than going into a voting booth, marking your ballot, and then submitting it, nobody but you knows who you voted for. Instead, qualified voters would go in front of the election judges, in front of anybody who came out to watch, and a lot of people came out to watch, and stated their votes for everyone to hear. This was a system known as viva voce. And one of the ways, as Michael was saying, one of the ways that candidates back then tried to engage with the voters, win over the voters, was to offer them some booze. Now, the best way to tell that story is through the story of an up-and-coming young politician in 1750s Virginia. You might have heard of him. His name was George Washington. In 1755, Washington decides he's going to run for the House of Burgesses. He loses badly. So he's trying to figure out what went wrong, and his friends say, well, you got in late in the election, people don't really know you, it's okay. But based on Washington's following actions, it seems that he blamed it on not providing enough alcohol. So in 1758, there's another election, and his supporters end up buying 46 gallons of beer, 40 gallons, 1 hogshead, 1 barrel, and 10 bowls of rum punch, 35 gallons of wine, 2 gallons of cider, 3.5 pints of brandy, and that's all about that. So his supporters buy that, and then he reimburses them. The law at the time said that a candidate could not offer voters any food, any beverages, but there was no rule against the candidate's friend, against the candidate's wife, his hired workers, indentured servants, enslaved workers, offering people alcohol as like, hey, have a drink. Oh, and let me tell you, so-and-so is a great candidate for office. And after the election, when Washington's friends are sending him the receipts, He actually says, not, whoa, you guys spent way too much. He writes, my only fear is that you spent with too sparing a hand. So imagine a friend comes up to you, it's like, all right, I'm running for office, here's my credit card, buy as much booze as you want and go meet the voters. And it worked, he won. Thus beginning a remarkable political career that ultimately takes him to the office of President of the United States. So again, that was how elections were conducted back then, and in fact, that continued into the 19th century. We actually have an article from an 1886 edition of the Alexandria Gazette where they wrote, the election passed off comparatively orderly, although whiskey flowed quite freely, but no breaches of the peace occurred. So again, because people were voting out in the open, because people were stating their votes for everybody to hear, candidates felt empowered to provide liquor, to provide all these other things that a candidate today would not provide. And obviously, if they tried to provide it today, the rules are a lot stricter and are more likely to be enforced. So next time you go voting, I wouldn't count on anybody offering you any booze.
Yeah, it's not going to happen today.
Not going to happen.
In fact, we've got people in this room, actually, who will make sure that doesn't happen. Before we go on to ranked choice voting, Scott, one thing I wanted to follow up on is you had the list there of the alcohol. I did some math once because we know how many people voted in this election, and I did the math equation, and it was basically like a gallon of booze per voter, basically, is what it comes down to, right? I mean, like, just amazing amount. And then I actually never heard this quote that you had just now about, my only regret is it might have been too sparing, another. That's a pretty wild story. All right, so that's the earliest mists of time from the 1750s. Now we're going to go way into the 2020s with Liz White and talk about the future of voting. So I want to talk about ranked choice voting because this is an option. Alexandria right now could move toward having a ranked choice system. There's the authority to do it. Our neighbors in Arlington have recently done it. Our more extended neighbors in Charlottesville are currently doing this. Alexandria might be doing this in the future. But Liz White, I'm going to throw you a curveball question here. Explain how a single transferable vote would work in a 6-way Alexandria City Council election.
Ooh, okay. I'm going to back up a little bit, and we're going to start with a more basic version of ranked choice voting where you're only electing one person at a time. And then we'll move into how you might use ranked choice voting to elect, hypothetically, a 6-member at-large city council at a time. Ranked choice voting is math, right? It is an approach to voters filling out their ballot that lets them more thoroughly express their candidate preference. No matter how many people you're electing, as a voter, you would go into your, not into the public square, drunk out of your mind. You would go in, with your very secret ballot, and instead of just saying, this is my top choice, or these are my 6 top choices, you get to say, this is my favorite candidate, this is my second favorite candidate, my third favorite candidate, and so on. You have the option to rank as many of the candidates as you would like to see in office, as you can kind of stomach the thought of having an office. The goal with single winner ranked choice voting is to identify a candidate who has the support from the majority of voters. Because if you are electing one person to represent an entire electorate, that's really the floor of what we should be asking of them, that at least half the voters are okay with this idea. So the way the tabulation works with one person is you tally up all of the first choice votes, everyone's first choice. If no one has reached that threshold, I mean, think about some of these congressional primaries we've had where we've got 7 candidates, 12 candidates, these huge fields, and we do not expect anyone to get near 50% on that first round. So you eliminate the candidate that got the fewest first choice votes. Now, if that was your candidate, if that was your first choice, you basically get an instant runoff. Your vote's now going to count for your second choice. You get to stay in the conversation. And we just repeat that until somebody hits that 50% threshold. Now, if you are electing multiple people at once, and I'm going to, for the sake of easier math this evening, let's say in this universe, the Alexandria City Council has decided that only half of them are going to run at a time. And again, this is for easier math. So if you're electing 3 people at a time, instead of a 50% threshold, you have a 25% threshold because more than 3 people can't get more than a fourth of the vote. So you have a 25% threshold, so that's one difference. From a voter perspective, nothing changes. The ballot looks exactly the same. You say my first choice, my second choice, my third choice, etc. The tabulation works exactly the same with one curveball. One of the reasons it's called a single transferable vote is because you don't want to punish voters for supporting a popular candidate. So if one of the candidates runs away with this, right, they're maybe a longtime incumbent or has a very broad base of support, and say they get 40% of the vote. If you imagine that each voter had a virtual dollar to spend to get someone elected that they like, well, that means a lot of people, lots more than necessary, pooled their money and got this popular candidate elected. Single transferable vote basically means you get change back. And so a small portion of your vote, if that was your first choice, goes to your next choice. So you get like a bonus vote. Other than that, it works exactly the same. I had to have someone explain this to me multiple times. So I see a lot of like furrowed brows. It's not you. It's probably me. From a voter perspective, it's a logical, intuitive, easy ballot to fill out, and the tabulation is done by a computer, so no one has to, be cutting ballots in pieces and redistributing them. But that's how it would work, because the point of single winner ranked choice voting is to identify that person with a majority. But if you're electing a lot of people at once, then you have the capability to really find proportional representation. So more segments of an electorate can have their voice heard on a legislative body. That's the short answer.
All right. All right. Before we move on to Jeff Shapiro, I want a quick follow-up, Liz White. One thing that perplexed me a little bit about the way this happened, this way this transpired in Arlington, is they had 2 spots they were voting for. They had 6 candidates. So that's the 2 open, 2 seats that they were voting for, 6 candidates. But the voters did not get to rank 6 choices. I always assumed, you have 6 candidates, you rank all 6 of them 1 to 6, but they were only able to rank 3. And my understanding of that is that was like a hardware problem. Like the machines couldn't handle the 6 ways. Is that right?
Even more seemingly silly than that, it's a ballot design problem. They could not, the width of the available ballot design didn't allow for extra columns. So they are updating their equipment soon. They will be able to do 6 the next time around. But ranked choice voting ballots, kind of in a best practice way, they're not designed to let you rank the entire field from top to bottom. First of all, that kind of defeats the point, because the likelihood that you're going to like all of the candidates is pretty low. The width of the ballot and the ballot design and how many rankings are available isn't correlated to how many candidates there are, because then you'd have to limit how many people can be in the race. The length of the ballot, the candidates' names, can be as long as you need it to be. You can have 12 people, like in a crowded Democratic congressional primary, hypothetically, but you're not going to ask someone to rank 1st through 12th. You're going to say, who's your favorite and who are your backup choices? And sometimes based on which vendor's being used, how the equipment works, how the ballot's designed, that might be 3, that might be 4, that might be 6. It's rarely more than 6, because that's just a lot to ask of a voter.
All right. Well, we're going to switch gears here now. So that's 2025 and into the future. So we've gone all the way back to the mist of time in 1750s. We've gone to the 2020s. Now we're going to shift to 1981, which was the first election for governor that my friend Jeff Shapiro covered. I want to take us back in time, Jeff Shapiro. Go ahead.
If I may, I believe it was Harry Lighthorsley who said of Washington, first in war, first in peace, first in the hearts of his countrymen. I guess given the way he applied alcohol, first in war, first in peace, first to belly up to the bar. And ranked choice voting is an issue in the legislative elections, in some legislative elections around the state. Charlottesville is moving in that direction. There's a candidate, I believe, in the Martinsville area, Democrat, who's very big on ranked choice voting. And Governor Youngkin was nominated by ranked choice voting in 2021 from a field of 7 candidates. And your point to the qualifications or the qualities of a candidate, it was a pretty underwhelming field of Republican candidates. Glenn Youngkin had going for him several things. He was a fresh face, he had no baggage, and of course he had very deep pockets. And I think it's safe to say that if the Republicans had not used ranked choice voting in 2021, he probably would have not been the nominee
Who would have?
for governor. Well, if there had been a traditional Republican convention, and this is of course before the Dan Hemler law kicked in, that could have been an interesting little fight. I mean, I don't know that I would have ruled out the, as she calls herself, Trump in heels, Amanda Chase. But
Well, you know what? Before you move on, Youngkin was nominated in a virtual convention that used ranked choice voting, so he actually is a product of ranked choice voting, but not a fan. He just recently vetoed a ranked choice voting bill.
And then also, to your point about these crowded fields, Democrats will be choosing a lieutenant governor's nominee from a field of 6, and in all likelihood, the nominee is going to be a minority nominee, with perhaps 20% of the vote, maybe a bit more. And Virginia doesn't have a runoff rule any longer. Now it's largely considered a threat to minority voting strength. But to 1981, my first statewide campaign, first gubernatorial campaign, please know I was clueless, hapless.
I'm like 8 years old, right?
Mystified but enthusiastic. And it was a race that really established itself 4 years earlier when Chuck Robb was elected lieutenant governor. He would be the Democratic nominee. And Marshall Coleman, a Republican, was elected Attorney General, the first Republican Attorney General, first elected Republican Attorney General in Virginia. So for 4 years, there was a lot of shadow boxing in the run-up to that 81 campaign between these two young men, both in their early 40s, both Marine combat veterans of Vietnam. Chuck Robb, of course, the son-in-law of a president. Marshall Coleman, a product of Virginia's Valley, this sort of hotbed of moderate republicanism. It was a counterweight to the excesses of all that conservative, largely segregationist, large D Democratic politics. What was really interesting about that campaign is how Marshall Coleman sort of reinvented himself as a Ronald Reagan conservative. It wasn't a particularly credible sell, particularly among conservative opinion and political leaders who remembered how he had worked over their candidate for Attorney General 4 years earlier, who had been part of the old Byrd organization, who had been at least noddingly supportive of massive resistance to the shuttering of public schools in defiance of the Brown decision. But this was also an election in which suburban voting strength, which has come to dominate Virginia, was fully tested. Chuck Robb, his home base was in McLean. Going back 40 plus years, Northern Virginia was still a competitive spot. There were a good number of Republicans representing this area in the Congress as well as in the legislature. And so one of the things that Chuck Robb had to do was make it fashionable to some degree to vote for a Democrat. And it was his calling, if you will, to sort of steer the Virginia Democratic Party, which had been lurching to the left for some years, more towards the middle, in hopes of not just generating enthusiastic support among Democrats who had been shut out of the governorship for 12 years, but in a state in which independent voters, to this day, still decide elections to present a Democrat with whom they could be comfortable. It certainly worked because Chuck Robb won by a majority of 100,000 votes. He carried 9 of then 10 congressional districts in Virginia, and better yet, for Democrats, led a sweep Democrats also were victorious with the candidates for lieutenant governor and attorney general, and that would usher in a period in which Democrats were dominant at the statewide level. They would carry the next 3 statewide elections. But what was very interesting at the time is that when Democrats were ascendant at the statewide level, Republicans were ascendant or ascending at the legislative level. A lot of this had to do with the nationalization, the incremental nationalization of our politics. In Republican, de facto Republican-leaning areas of the state, say the Valley of Virginia or the South Side, there were still large numbers of Democrats representing these areas in the legislature, not because they were Democrats, but because they were friends and neighbors. And there was a strongly personal element to our politics at the legislative level, to some degree at the local level, where partisanship is, somewhat, well, it's accelerating, but back then was fairly diminished. And now we find ourselves, fast forward 40 plus years, in a commonwealth with 134 cities and counties. There are 10 with populations of roughly 200,000 to 1.2 million and change, Fairfax. Most of them flank Interstate 64 and 95. And if a candidate, more often than not a Democrat, carries those jurisdictions, there aren't enough votes left in the rest of the state for the other side to catch up. That is how lopsided metropolitan, suburban, and urban voting strength is in Virginia. If you were a Martian visiting Virginia after a gubernatorial election and you looked at one of those color-coded maps and someone said to you, well, red denotes a Republican-carried jurisdiction, blue a Democrat-carried jurisdiction, and oh, by the way, the Democrats swept, I suspect the Martian would furrow his or her, well, if gender could even be determined, brow. But this is a remarkable change in our politics in a remarkably short period of time, considering that Chuck Robb, in his statewide victory, carried places like the 9th Congressional District in the coal fields, the 5th Congressional District, the heart of the South Side, the tobacco belt, the 4th Congressional District. The only district that he didn't carry was the 6th Congressional District, which is sort of the beating heart of old line rural republicanism.
So you've raised a new pronoun issue that we haven't even considered yet, Martian pronouns, is it he, his, her? We'll discuss that next agenda, Alexandria. Before we move on back to Scott Viereck, follow-up for Jeff Shapiro. One thing that I think is notable about that 1981 election for governor is that everybody knew who the candidates were way ahead of time, like way, way ahead of time. We think that we've got our candidates early because LeVar Stoney was going to run as a Democrat against Abigail Spanberger. He dropped out. She became the nominee. That happened last year. And then this year we had Dave LaRock and Amanda Chase were going to be on the ballot, but they couldn't collect enough signatures. And so the reason I bring all this up is, we feel like we know early who the candidates are going to be. But in that 1981 election, didn't they know who the candidates were going to be like in 1977?
Oh, yeah. And, I think there's a larger issue here, and some of it is really cultural. I think it's safe to say that most of the people sitting in this room are overinformed and overstimulated when it comes to politics and public policy. However, I'd suggest to you that the people whose votes matter most, ordinary, in this case, Alexandrians, ordinary Virginians, the competition for their time and their attention and their thoughtful consideration of politics, candidates, public policy is acute. Candidates aren't simply competing with candidates. what's the basic cable package now, if there is even one? 800 channels. It's nonstop sports. It's round-the-clock entertainment. It's news, and now it's hyper-personalized because it's whatever is streaming on your mobile phone. That creates an enormous amount of static, an enormous amount of noise. And politicians have to break through that, and they often have seconds to do so. And I suspect, certainly Virginia political history shows, and it's probably not unique to Virginia, that the messages that get through tend to be the most compact, tend to be the most precise, often, sadly, for those of us who have, civics books rattling around in our chests rather than hearts, something trivial. In 1997, Jim Gilmore, an attorney general, was a Republican nominee for governor, and he managed a statewide Republican sweep, the first modern Republican statewide sweep, by a huge landslide on the strength of 3 words or 3 syllables, no car tax. And here we are, 35 plus years later, still wrestling with that issue.
And it still comes up on the campaign trail. So we did get a couple of questions about the ward system and the history of the ward system in Alexandria. If you are a member of the audience and you want to know more about the ward system, you want to look at Scott Vierek, because he appeared on our panel, was it last year?
I think
the year
2
before
years
that,
ago.
2 years ago?
Yeah.
And he went into excruciating detail about the ward system, so we're not going to do that again tonight. However, if
I also
you are
have an
interested-
article about it if you want to read that.
Yeah. The article, I'm sure, was great. I was talking about Agenda Alexandria, buddy. All right, so, but we did, so there's the ward system, but in addition to that, there's this question, which is, will lead into something I know that you have done some research on. Why is it organized this way? It's partisan, they're elected as Ds or Rs. It's all at large. It's not staggered. How is it that we've got this organization? In answering the question, I want to know more about this background of the Common Council and the Board of Alderman, because Alexandria City Hall used to have a bicameral legislature.
Yeah, that's absolutely correct. So, as I'm sure many of you know, the current form we have set up with the mayor and the council, and the mayor is elected separately, but they all vote on the same issues. The mayor doesn't have veto power. That's not the way it was for most of Alexandria's history. So when the town was first established, you had a board of trustees who were appointed by the House of Burgesses, and then when a trustee resigned or died, the trustees then picked another trustee to replace that person. So nobody was voting for the trustees. And then during the Revolution, Alexandria was formally incorporated as a town, and it's got its first form of elected government. Now, who could vote was still very limited, but for the first time, people in Alexandria could pick their local representatives. Now, that system was set up where everyone went to the polls, it was all at large, and they picked a group of 12 council members. And then the council members picked a mayor, a recorder, and 4 aldermen. Now, we don't know a huge amount about this first form of elected municipal government in Alexandria. We do know that the mayor and the aldermen were expected to, in addition to serving as a legislative body, also serve as judges on what was called a court of hustings, so dealing with smaller cases. And then Alexandria is ceded to the District of Columbia, and they get another charter. And for those of you who are interested in wards, that's when the wards come in. It's when the city gets a charter from Congress, when it's part of the district, that the city is divided into 4 wards. But they get rid of the Board of Aldermen. They get rid of the mayor at that point. So it's just the council members, and 4 are elected from each ward. Then the city is retroceded back to Virginia. And then shortly after that, it gets another charter. The wards stay. It's still a ward system. But the aldermen come back. So now you're going to have 4 council members elected from each ward, and then you're going to have 2 aldermen elected from each ward in alternate years. So members of council have to run for office every single year. So if you think we have a lot of election these days, can you imagine we're electing a city council. I thought we just did that. The aldermen, they get a little bit more of a break. They're getting elected every 2 years or so. And they're really serving as a separate legislative body. So if you look at the old records, you're seeing the Board of Alderman, they're debating issues and they come to a conclusion. City Council, they're debating the issues, they come to a conclusion. They got to make sure that they're both in agreement, and then it goes to the mayor. And there are instances where that creates problems. There are some times in the city's history, I'm thinking of one instance in 1911, I believe, where the city council, they couldn't get their stuff together. So the reports we have is that the Board of Aldermen, they got through their business, and then they had to wait. And then they had to wait. And then they had to wait some more because the city council was debating and debating and debating this tax issue, and they could not figure it out. So you've got really kind of, in some ways, very similar to the current, the federal government, with you having a bicameral legislature with a Senate and a House of Representatives. And for legislation to get to the president's desk, it needs to be reconciled between the two bodies. Now, for a variety of reasons, by the early 20th century, that system, it's not working out too well for Alexandria. The city is struggling a bit. They're struggling to retain industry. The system of having the aldermen and the common council is being viewed as inefficient. There's an effort in the late 1910s to get rid of it that fails by 8 votes. Then a couple years later, in the early 1920s, they do another referendum to replace that with a council manager system, and this time it succeeds. And one of the things I'm looking forward to researching in the future is that one of the things that changed between that first referendum and the second referendum was a certain amendment was passed, and now women were allowed to vote. And the documents we have suggest that a lot of Alexandria women got very involved in this question and set up committees to urge other voters to, hey, vote for this new form of government. So under this new form of government in the 1920s, the wards were gone. The number of elected officials was shrunk down to 5. You had 5 council members, and they would choose the mayor amongst themselves, which at one point led to a very funny instance where you only had 3 members of council, and they needed to select a mayor. And so the guy who was nominated, he didn't want to vote for himself. Somebody else nominated him, but then was like, well, I nominated you, so I can't, vote for you. And then you had the last guy who cast the winning vote. So we had a mayor in Alexandria's history who was elected with only 1 vote. So that small council has its own problems. People appreciate having a city manager, the more professionalized bureaucracy, but the small council, people have problems with that. During this time, the city's also looking to annex the town of Potomac, and people in Potomac aren't. That's a whole other question that would take too much time to go into, but needless to say, many people in Potomac are not happy about the annexation. And so in the early 1930s, you have another revision where the wards come back, and you've got the city divided into 6 wards, and you've got a member of council elected from each ward, and then you also have several council members elected at large. That stays in place until the late 1940s when you have another referendum bringing it back to the at-large system. So that's about close to 150 years of history in a couple of minutes. So Michael, did that answer your question?
It did, actually. You went through it. Although at the very end, I want you to explain the 1940s part. Okay, so they didn't have a ward system, and then they did have a ward system, and then they didn't. And then so in the 1940s, they looked at their ward system, and there was a big problem with their ward system, which is why they got rid of it.
Yeah, so critiques of the ward system had been growing for some time, and there was an effort in 1944 to repeal the ward system. That failed. Then, about 4 years later, there's another referendum, and there's a couple things that end up getting blamed for the end of the ward system. One was that the city was having a lot of trouble keeping the wards about equal in terms of voters. So at one point, you had a couple hundred voters in one ward, and then you had over 1,000 in another ward. So that actually got the city a rebuke from the state government, where like, hey, you guys need to be more on top of this. There was also, at one point, the council elected a rather controversial individual to be city manager. That got a reaction. That prompted an effort to launch the repeal. Now, another question that is often asked in the questions of wards and at large is, what role did racism play in this? And obviously, this is happening during an era of Jim Crow, and it has been charged in other jurisdictions that the move from a ward system to an at-large system was motivated by an effort to dilute the black vote, disempower the black vote. And there's a really profound quote from, I believe, the 1960s from a reporter talking about the situation in Richmond, where they talked, and he essentially says, they moved the wards around again and again so that we couldn't elect a black city council member. And when it became impossible to do that, then they went at large. Now, was that the case in Alexandria? That's something that my research, I haven't been able to find anything that suggests that. But certainly that's something that we can't quite rule out yet. It's something that as I continue to research this, as other historians continue to research it, we need to be cognizant of it. Again, this was during the era of Jim Crow. Alexandria, like the rest of Virginia, like much of the country, had taken efforts to disempower the black vote after the Civil War. So it's certainly something that, even though I haven't found any evidence of that playing a role in the move away from wards in Alexandria, it might very well have been the case. The evidence just hasn't appeared yet. And certainly it seems that in other jurisdictions that racism did play a role in the move from wards to at large.
Yeah, I haven't seen any evidence that getting rid of the wards in 1940 was prompted by racism. Certainly an option, the one that we would not want to rule out, something you would want to think about. I actually found in my research more evidence toward financial mismanagement, that the ward healers felt like they were authorized to spend money, but then the city manager also felt like he was authorized to spend money, so they spent money separately for the same thing, so it cost twice as much money to do government, and so everybody's taxes went up, and that's when they got angry and got rid of the ward system because their tax bills were too high because of the corruption and mismanagement at City Hall. So switching gears here to ranked choice voting, I actually have more questions from the audience about ranked choice voting than any other topic. Liz White, you're going to be popular. I'm going to ask four of these because there's a theme here, which is basically how does all this work? Like, what's the bigger picture? Is it true ranked choice voting will make ballot easier for people who want to run? Okay, so this is like, what's the pool of candidates that we're talking about? What interests oppose ranked choice voting? So this is kind of like, who's in favor of this? Who's against it? We already talked about the governor vetoing a ranked choice voting bill. He's not a fan, despite the fact it's his origin story. So, like, who are the sides? What are the downsides? I mean, this is like a theme to these questions from the audience. And then how are the machines? How are the votes counted? Is this like humans counting the votes or machines counting the votes? But so let's start with the who's for this and who's against this, because we often get the sense that this might even be a partisan issue. That's those crazy liberal Dems that want this. Is that true?
It depends on who you ask. I mean, as I think one of the first things I said tonight is that ranked choice voting is math, right? It's not a political philosophy. It is not a political ideology. It is a tool to encapsulate a more thorough representation of what voters actually want. A lot of democracy reforms get painted with a pretty partisan brush. They tend to get painted, especially on a national scale, with a pretty blue brush. Ranked choice voting, I mean, as Jeff brought up, the Republican Party of Virginia used ranked choice voting in their 2021 statewide nominating convention. They also then went, well, that went well. Look at us in the governor's office for the first time in 12 years. They also then nominated 4 congressional candidates because it was a tool that worked for them. Now, this went through about 2022. In 2022, there was a very prominent ranked choice voting election in Alaska, in which the only headline most of us saw in the lower 48 was that Sarah Palin lost an election in Alaska because of ranked choice voting. And then we saw, and Lisa Murkowski won an election with ranked choice voting in Alaska. This must be a Democratic tool. This must be something that will never elect a conservative ever, ever, ever. If you scratch the surface of that story a little bit, one, the first thing we realized is that Alaskans really like Lisa Murkowski and really don't like Sarah Palin. She was a uniquely flawed candidate in that time. But we got that headline, and then we had President Trump weigh in and say, see, ranked choice voting is corrupt and bad. So all of a sudden you saw places like Utah, where localities in pretty red Utah, localities, like 24 of them had been using ranked choice voting since the 90s. All of a sudden that number started to shrink because it just became, really hard to be a Republican who was publicly in favor of ranked choice voting. Those were some real partisan headwinds that you were facing. The path in Virginia has been really interesting because, as we've said, the Republican Party of Virginia is who has used it over and over effectively. They were able to use it, just to clarify, because they would run party-run nominating contests, so they could kind of choose their methodology. Democrats who prefer a state-run primary don't have that option. So it wasn't exactly an apples-to-apples choice. So they're the ones who have used it. Former Republican Party of Virginia Chair Rich Anderson was elected to that job with ranked choice voting. I've mentioned all the times they've used it. Democrats are the ones who vote for it in the General Assembly. The bills are not quite party line, but they're close. I honestly can't tell you how Governor Youngkin feels about ranked choice voting, but I think he doesn't like it enough to stick his neck out for it. So this, I think, leads into what are the downfalls? A lot of the arguments against ranked choice voting are made in bad faith. Some of them are not. Some of them are legitimate considerations. This is a big change for election officials, and it's a big change for voters, and change is hard, and sometimes it's expensive, and those are all legitimate concerns. Let's talk about voter education. How are we going to reach vulnerable communities and make sure they are not left behind because it's a new kind of ballot that they haven't seen before? There are legitimate considerations in how to do this well. And then there are a lot of things that are just blatantly untrue, like this violates one man, one vote. No, it doesn't. You only get one vote at a time. You get the same number of votes as everybody else. You're not getting 3 votes because you filled in 3 bubbles. Courts have weighed in on this. You get a lot of disinformation where people throw a lot of complicated sounding facts at you, and voters go, "Ooh, that does sound scary." And it's poll after poll, exit poll after exit poll across the country show that voters understand how to use this. They like it. They feel better represented. Most of the bad faith arguments can be traced back to the Heritage Foundation. Specifically, they spend a lot of money trying to stamp this out. But again, I don't like to write off everybody who raises an eyebrow about this because it's a big change. What were the other questions? We count by machines.
Well, who's for this? Who's against it? What are the upsides? What are the downsides? That was basically the theme of it.
Sure. I think the upsides are varied. I think there's a lot of upsides, and it solves different problems in different communities, right? We talked about 12 people running for the Democratic nomination. That helps voters sort through those candidates. Think about the 2020 Democratic presidential primary. And not only could you kind of sort through, because everybody who was voting in that primary probably had 5 candidates that they were okay with out of 18 or however many there were. The other problem it would have solved in that particular election, because it was COVID, because we had all of these brand new voting accommodations, early voting and mail-in and drop boxes, a lot of people voted pretty early. And because we're a Super Tuesday state, a lot of prominent candidates dropped out right before Virginians got to vote. So if you voted for Pete Buttigieg, or you voted for Amy Klobuchar, or you voted for Kamala Harris, your vote went in the trash can. There was nothing that anyone could do with it. They were not in the race anymore. If you'd had ranked choice voting, you just had better odds. If you'd said, okay, I voted for Amy Klobuchar, Pete Buttigieg, Joe Biden, they'd go, well, that one, nope, okay, here you go. Your vote's going to count for this person who's still in the race. Your vote's going to count like you showed up on election day with all of the relevant information.
Well, actually, can I pause you there?
Yeah,
because
please.
If I remember that 2020 Super Tuesday correctly, if I remember the events here, several of those candidates you just mentioned dropping out did so in the 45-day window of early voting.
Right.
Yeah.
Right, so people did already go vote.
Lots of people would have cast their ballot even before they were able to rank them, right? You can't...
I'm just saying, if we'd had ranked choice voting available then, you'd have a better chance of
But they dropped
one
out
of your
during the
rankings.
vote.
Yeah, a lot
though.
of them did.
So then you would have to have election officials.
Well, if
make
you
it-
have your number one's Pete Buttigieg and he can't get a vote, but your number two is Elizabeth Warren and she can take your vote,
But
then
don't you
your
have to
vote
set
just
up the
goes to
rules
Elizabeth
before the
Warren.
voting starts, though?
Yeah, we would have had to pass ranked choice voting a long time ago.
Yeah, well,
But-
I was just curious. So, Jeff Shapiro, we have a question from the audience that dovetails with something I wanted to ask you about, which is the changes, the shifts that you have seen in your years covering Virginia politics. Question from the audience: is the current degree of polarization the result of polarization of cable news? You could add TikTok to that if you, right? So cable news and/or TikTok, social media, or is it the other way around? And so I'm curious if you could talk about the degree of polarization and what's prompting it, but also kind of reflect on the changing nature of Virginia politics in the time that you've been here covering it.
In a word, I think that the polarization that's evident at the legislative level and in local politics as well, particularly in some of the larger jurisdictions, is just a reminder of the continuing nationalization of our politics. And that is, to some degree, driven by population churn, demographic change. Virginia, when I landed in Central Virginia, in Richmond in 1979, there was still sort of a Brigadoon-like quality to Virginia politics. This kind of mist would surround the state and just block out all of this extraneous noise. And friends and neighbors were elected. But in 1979, the majority of people who lived in Virginia were born here. And now the majority of people who live in Virginia are, present company included, and I expect a good number of people in this room, this being Northern Virginia, are come-heres, are non-natives. And those new Virginians, capital N-E-W Virginians, who may have been voting in other states, bring with them practices, traditions, a temperament that governs, pun intended, their attitudes and their votes come election time. Also, in this Virginia, in which the majority of us are non-natives, 2/3 of us live in cities and suburbs. Many in those 10 or so cities and counties to which I referred earlier. So there's a lot of this nationalized voting tendency concentrated in this handful of communities. Also, to give you an idea just how quickly this change has occurred, in the 1945 gubernatorial election, so this is the first election following this cataclysmic global event, World War II, in which billions of dollars are pumped into Virginia as part of the war effort. The rough outlines of suburban-dominated Virginia emerge as people descend on Washington, part of this battle against global fascism. But still, in 1945, 2/3 of the people who lived in Virginia lived in the countryside. So rural Virginia had a significant impact on our politics, well into what is largely described as the modern era. And then, of course, in 1945, this being Jim Crow Virginia, the electorate was small and very manageable. I think in that election for governor, there were maybe 300,000 votes cast, 400,000 votes cast. Now in Virginia, at least eligible to exercise the franchise, are 6.1 million people. So I think that the nationalization of our politics and the elevated importance of the letter that follows a candidate's name, these become very powerful cues for voters, particularly newcomers. That is compounding this problem. And I don't know that one can, rule out sort of the overarching ambitions of a political personality or two. That has a way of compounding this. Glenn Youngkin, immediately believed his clips, and having won the governorship in what the outside world believed was a blue trending state, and all those political consultants to whom he stroked fat checks and who were happy to remain in his good graces because, what's better than a self-financing candidate, right? So he went ahead and, did this national presidential striptease. I'm not allowed to say that on the radio, apparently. I've been warned several times by the news director at Radio IQ. It's apparently, God forbid, listeners should have untoward thoughts.
Hey, man, it's public radio.
But I think that Governor Youngkin's national aspirations magnified this problem at the legislative level because it did make a difference what the bill pushed by a Republican did. It might be stinkingly local in its application, but if the Democrats heard it had been endorsed by the governor of the Youngkin administration, it became an excuse to kill it. And I know Michael and I have talked about this on occasion. This Youngkin phenom became a very difficult complication for a distraction, if you will, for a lot of local Republicans who just wanted to deliver for their jurisdictions. So I suspect that is a somewhat long-winded way of saying that sadly we don't seem to be thinking as much about the local as we seem to be thinking about the national.
So yeah, Jeff Shapiro and I appear on the radio every Friday in Roanoke and most of the state, and he had this thing for a while. He would talk about Glenn Youngkin and his presidential striptease, and then my editor in Roanoke said, we can't say this on NPR, presidential striptease, so it's censored again, but not in this room. There's no FCC monitor in here. I actually recently had a delegate from Fairfax County say of the governor, well, if he had any balls, he would have vetoed the bill. And I said, I can't put that on NPR, but Laura Jane Cohn, if you know her, she's kind of a fiery person. All right, Scott Vierock, I'm going to...
One thing, in regard to ranked choice voting, and I think in its appeal, particularly to the Republican Party, there is litigation in federal court in Lynchburg, just initiated, that challenges what in effect is a mandate that the parties nominate their candidates by an open primary, a state-managed primary. And if the Republicans are successful, Dan Hemler, a local delegate, is responsible for this requirement. That would mean Republicans would probably race back to conventions, and probably conventions in which ranked choice voting was the practice.
Served them well in the past. They'd be smart to do it.
Turning our attention to our historian question from the audience that dovetails with something I know that you've done research on for this evening. Please, a question from the audience. Please discuss why Alexandria has partisan local elections. Were elections here ever nonpartisan? Scott Vierock, I know that from your research, you dug up some Whig candidates for the Alexandria Common Council, right? Who I guess are buying ads to say, elect me, I'm the Whig candidate. So I think Frank Fannin knows you don't win elections unless you buy newspaper advertising, right?
Yeah, so I would say, and it's interesting about the nonpartisan part, there was actually an effort in the mid-20th century. Armistead Booth, who some of you are aware of, he was a well-known political figure in Alexandria for many years, really championed an effort to get Alexandria elections to be officially nonpartisan. And for reasons that I'm still trying to figure out, ultimately nothing came of it. But from the documentation we have, he was very passionate about this, and he did his best to get it through, and there were a good number of citizens who supported him in this, so that's certainly something that I look forward to continuing the research in the future. But in terms of looking at Alexandria's past, by and large, yeah, you do seem to have people running affiliated with a political party. Alexandria, for many years before the Civil War, is a town associated with the Whig Party. There were some Democrats elected to city council positions in Alexandria, but the Whigs tended to predominate. After the Civil War, you have it becoming a much more Democrat town. And to Michael's point, what you're seeing during the antebellum era is people starting to make the case in the newspapers for why people should vote for them. And that's a pretty interesting change because in the 18th century, George Washington's time, a candidate typically did not campaign for themselves. The idea was that a candidate would be reluctant to take power, would have others campaign on their behalf, and when they were offered the nomination, say, I only do this because my country or my state or my city needs me. And then now that we have the documentation from Washington and Jefferson, we know that they were writing people and being like, hey, is so-and-so running? They're not. All right, I'm getting in, start putting out feelers. But you typically did not go and promote yourself. And it's interesting looking at these ads is you're starting to see that switch from I am doing this because I am called to run by my fellow citizens to, hey, I'm running, I'm the best person, here's my experience, you should vote for me. And interestingly enough, when we're seeing these ads in the pre-Civil War years, they tend to be not for city council, not for mayor, though there's a couple of those. They tend to be for some of the other things that they elected, most notably superintendent of the gas works. So in charge of the gas works that produced the gas that lit the street lamps in Alexandria. And so in 1859, one gentleman named Joseph Grimes puts in an announcement in the paper saying, having received some solicitations on the subject, I respectfully announce myself as a candidate for the office of Superintendent of Gas, and most respectfully solicit the suffrages of my fellow citizens. So you can very much see that, well, I'm not doing this because I'm ambitious. I'm doing it because others have reached out to me, and they've called upon me to step up. Now, by contrast, Jacob Roxby, who was the incumbent, he put an ad, and I'm not going to read the whole thing because it's old paper, but he essentially goes, look, I've been doing this job. While doing this job, I've been visiting other gas works around the country. So I can take the best practices from these other gas works and apply them here to Alexandria. So that service you're getting from me, that quality you've come to know, I'm going to make it even better during my next term. So you're starting to see that shift, again, away from the, oh, I'm only doing this because my fellow citizens are calling to me to serve, to, I'm the best one for the job, here's my qualifications, you should vote for me. You're also seeing, and this is the last thing, you also see ads that are framed as kind of endorsements, but the endorsements are very, very vague. So one goes, we respectfully recommend to the voters at the enduring municipal election as a candidate for chief engineer of the fire department, Hiram Webster, feeling assured if the honor should be conferred on him, the duty will be most faithfully and most impartially performed. And that is signed, many firemen. And if you think that's vague, I found other ads that are signed, many people. So
Many people are saying.
Many people are saying.
Yeah, I'm curious about the election for the superintendent of the gas works. Is that a campaign that had a lot of hot air? I'll leave, folks. All right.
Solid joke.
So, Liz White, moving on to ranked choice voting. Obviously, you've prompted some interest in the audience. People are really interested in this topic. I'm curious. So, looking ahead, people in our audience should keep their eye on Charlottesville, right? What's going on in Charlottesville?
So Charlottesville became the only ranked choice voting in the Virginia Code right now is a pilot program where cities or counties can adopt ranked choice voting for their city council or county board of supervisors elections. That decision lies with the city council or the board of supervisors. And Charlottesville just became the second locality in Virginia after Arlington to say, okay, let's try it out. So they're doing like a pilot within a pilot program, and they are using ranked choice voting as we speak in this June 2025 city council primary. So they are the Democratic Party in Charlottesville is, well, not the Democratic Party, it's the Democratic primary. They are nominating their Democratic candidates for city council. And then in November, we're gonna head back up north and we're gonna go back to Arlington. They are going to use ranked choice voting for their county board general election, which will be the first general election done with ranked choice voting in the Commonwealth.
The first?
The first general, yep.
2025.
2025.
Charlottesville City Council election.
Arlington. Charlottesville's now for the primary.
I'm sorry.
Arlington's in November
Yeah,
for
you
the
said that.
general.
Okay, right, we're moving into the future. Speaking of the future, I want to get Jeff Shapiro. So we talked to Jeff Shapiro to reflect on the current election. So we talked about 1981, and we talked about all the changes. What's going on right now? So we've got the top of the ticket is we've already got our candidates, and we have a June primary where you got 6 candidates running for the Democratic position on lieutenant governor. So the top of the ticket is weirdly this lieutenant governor race that most people know nothing about, right?
And there is as well on the Democratic side a two-candidate race for the Attorney General's nomination. This is a reminder that these are candidates who are taking the longer view. No one seems to run for AG or LG without an interest in GOV. One of the jokes, of course, is that AG is an acronym for aspiring governor. But, you know, to this point on which I've needlessly hammered about, you know, the aggravating level of partisanship, the nationalization of our politics, I kind of have this sense, this is by no means a prediction, but it's sort of a warning that we could be looking at another statewide sweep this year, one party winning the governorship, the lieutenant governorship, and the attorney general's office, largely because of these external factors that are having a very significant effect on everyone's thinking, the elevated anger associated with Trump, and then, of course, just the dollars and cents of it all. This, you know, very aggressive move against the bureaucracy, very aggressive move against just federal spending in general, employment and spending, national beneficence, big pillars of the Virginia economy. And we got a taste of this in 2017 when there was a Democratic sweep, largely fueled by this outrage over Trump. I think it's safe to say that it's, you know, outrage to about the third power now, and it's rippling through all areas of the state. It may not be enough to, you know, tip places in the very red valley blue, but it will be, I'm certain, it's going to contribute to an elevated turnout in places like Montgomery County, the seat of Virginia Tech, a huge driver of the economy. And you'll see that area probably go blue. It does on occasion, usually if there's an excuse to do so. And the Democrats carrying Montgomery County could very well pick up a House seat. And I think that the House of Delegates elections are not to be overlooked. The Democratic Party has a very narrow advantage to one seat. There are about a dozen seats that are held by Republicans that are either Kaine or Harris carried that the Democrats believe they have a chance to pick up. If there are 8 or 10 pickups by the Democrats, that's going to move them in comfortably up into the 60s. That's going to make for a pretty aggressive, large D Democratic House of Delegates, paired with, if Abigail Spanberger has extended the gift of office as governor, that could very well put a good deal of pressure on her, because the Senate is secure for another couple of years, to maybe push the envelope a bit. I think she's clearly trying, in a sort of a Chuck Robb mold, to sort of walk that middle path. Sometimes I think we're seeing a somewhat tortured product. Some of you may have seen stories in the Virginia press on her position on Virginia's prohibition on compulsory union membership as a condition for employment, the right to work law, as it's called, adopted in 1947. She indicated that she would not favor full repeal. What does that mean? And that she thinks there could be some modest modifications. What has she in mind? This is something that Winsome Earl Sears, the Republican nominee for governor, first black elected statewide in Virginia, first black woman elected statewide in Virginia, aspiring to become the first black woman in either party to be elected to the governorship of any U.S. state. I don't know that right to work is necessarily an issue that's going to get a lot of voters excited. It's probably going to get the business class all revved up. We're already seeing signs of that. But whether that means they'll be flooding over to the Republican side, I'm not so sure. What I would be watching for in Virginia, because remember, there are 2 states that choose a governor in the year immediately following a presidential election. New Jersey, which is reflexively Democratic for the most part, and Virginia, viewed as a competitive state. These are elections that take on great national significance, sort of, early indicators of, the nation's directions heading into the midterms, the presidential midterms. I wonder if, despite her very fraught relationship with Donald Trump, if Winsome Earl Sears can expect help from the Trump White House. I'm not so sure. The Virginian who was the co-manager of the Trump presidential campaign, Chris LaCivita, spends a lot of time on X, formerly Twitter, trashing Winsome Earl Sears. That may be an early indicator of the president's preferences. And then there is also Elon Musk and his affiliated PACs. Could, a check for $30 million suddenly land in the Winsome Earl Sears treasury, and what difference might something like that make? So it's going to be a great and noisy election, and I would only make this point. I know that Democrats have been very excited about Abigail Spanberger, and I have no intention of speaking ill of either candidate, but I will make this point, that the candidates for governor are really limited in their experience in state government. Winsome Earl Sears, as the lieutenant governor, has sort of, cleaved herself to Glenn Youngkin, trying to represent herself as his logical heir. There's not a lot that she's done or said that would support her claims that she's a big player in that administration. I will say this: she runs a very tight ship in the state Senate. She's an excellent presiding officer, and she casts a few tie-breaking votes, one of which is going to get her in trouble on abortion rights. But Spanberger, as a 3-term member of Congress, has certainly been bloodied in the political realm. But Michael, I think, will vouch for this point, that operating in state government in a place like Richmond requires different skills. It requires knowing different people. It requires mastering the rhythm of the place, the zeitgeist, the buttermilk culture of the place, and that neither is really schooled in that leads me to wonder if either would get off to a rougher start. Certainly, that was a problem with Glenn Youngkin as someone who had no experience in state government. And it showed. He has now sort of been reduced to governing by veto, if only to make a point about, who he is and to underscore his presumed national aspirations. The winner in Virginia will, and this is inevitable, I fear, be viewed as a hot national prospect. If you go back to 1969, which is sort of the start of the competitive era in Virginia with the election of Linwood Holton, the first Republican, modern Republican governor of Virginia, I think that's, we're talking about 14 governors. All but 2 were mentioned as national candidates. The 2 who were not were probably the most consequential governors. Mills Godwin, who was elected first in 1965 as a Democrat and then returned to the governorship in 1973 as a Republican, the only person elected to the governorship of Virginia twice by a vote of the people. And Jerry Beliles, who was a stunningly productive governor who managed to squeeze 5 years out of a 4-year term by calling a special session in September of his first year as governor to address transportation finance. And by the way, that was a feat that was not matched by a governor until 2013, when a wounded Bob McDonnell reluctantly broke his no tax increase pledge to support elevated financing for highways and rail. And I'll shut up.
We love hearing you talk, Jeff Shapiro. All right, we're about to get the hook because Agenda Alexandria has never been at the seminary before. This is a really great facility. However, we don't want to overstay our welcome and not be invited back, so we're going to have to wrap this up. I'll do a lightning round here just with Liz White and Scott Viereck here. Liz White, when you were explaining ranked choice voting, I saw the furrowed brows. You mentioned it. There's some skepticism in this audience and in the wider community. What would you say to people who said, this is really complicated?
I always say ranked choice voting isn't hard, it is new. Change is hard. One of the things that we do with coalition partners like the League of Women Voters and other groups is voter education, is events like this, is going to as many communities as possible to, one, just introduce it to the conversation, right? Like just say, hey, there's this tool available. Do you think that's something that would be helpful in your community? Because I also, I'm one woman from Chesterfield. I'm not going to come to Alexandria and say, I know what you should do. Every place that has used it, exit polls show that voters understand it. I think that's directly related to the quality of voter education, but people like ranked choice voting when they use it. They feel represented more. A higher percentage of voters get a candidate that they supported, maybe not their first choice, but someone that they supported elected. People feel like their voice is more represented. I'm also going to put a quick plug in. If you're interested in learning more, we do have clipboards floating around. We've got little postcards you can take home. You can sign up to receive more information because I could talk about this for hours. So if you have other venues you'd like to discuss this in, I'm all yours.
All right, and I want to end with an anecdote that Scott Viereck is going to share that sort of doubles down on something he mentioned, but I want to make sure this is in your mind, that today your vote is secret. No one knows how you voted. You don't have to tell. You could tell somebody if you wanted to, but you don't have to. Your vote is secret. It has not always worked that way. It wasn't until the 1870s that your vote was secret, and before that, everybody knew who you voted for, right? In fact, there's an interesting 1860 story that you dug up.
Yeah, so turning to 1860, which, as you can imagine, was not only a very consequential election, but also an incredibly polarized one throughout the country, but especially here in Alexandria. In that election, you had 4 candidates running. The Democrat Party had split, so you had Breckinridge representing the Southern Democrats, Douglas representing the Northern ones. You had John Bell of the short-lived Constitutional Union Party, and then, of course, you had the ultimate victor in the election, Abraham Lincoln. Now, in Alexandria, Abraham Lincoln got 2 votes. And we actually have an account of one of the people who cast that vote for Lincoln. His name was Andrew Weil. And as Michael mentioned, during this time, voting was still public. And there was no secret ballot, so everybody knew how Weil voted. And in fact, he had some of his friends being like, dude, don't. Maybe sit this one out. But he said, no, I'm gonna go vote. he started getting threats. A mob followed him home. As far as we can tell, he avoided direct violence. No, he wasn't physically harmed. His family wasn't physically harmed. But you can imagine just how terrifying that was for him. And you can imagine in other situations that were not written down where, a freedman voting for the first time after the Civil War, seeing their former enslaver looking from the crowd. So that's the big downside to that voting in public, is there's that threat of recrimination. And that's why nowadays we can go in, we can cast our ballot, and it's as public as we want it to. If we want to walk out of the voting booth and be like, hey, I voted for so-and-so, we can do that. But if we want to keep it private, then we can. And I think that reflects, just how much the system has evolved over the years, and also just the importance of voting. The fact that even though Lincoln was not going to get a lot of votes in Alexandria, Andrew Wiley's vote was not going to swing Virginia to Lincoln, it got people revved up, it got people angry. That speaks to the power of the ballot. That speaks to the power we have when we cast that ballot. And there's a long history in Virginia and unfortunately throughout the United States of people trying to stop other people from voting. So that to me is just such a reminder of how important it is to research the issues, research the candidates, and to go to that voting booth. Because there have been so many people throughout American history, throughout Virginia history, throughout Alexandria's history, who were not able to vote, who were turned away from voting, who were threatened for casting a vote, for trying to cast a vote, and that's something we shouldn't take for granted.
And if you're looking for a bookmark, he's got a huge stack of Alexandria Historical Society bookmarks, so please take some of these because the Historical Society wants to offload them. All right, one more thing that we're going to do tonight. I'm going to call up to the microphone your new chairman of Agenda Alexandria, Steve Davidson.
Good evening. Many of you don't know me. I am Steve. Kind of interesting, the board this year has had a lot of turnover. We have many new members, and 3 of the 4 officers have never been an officer in Agenda Alexandria before. So that means this is an opportunity for new ideas and changes, and we would like to hear from you. I intend, and I don't right now have keys to the website, but I'd like to add a link so that people can drop suggestions to the board so that we can hear your ideas for things that we could do that might be better, might be different, might be worth an experiment. I'm a physicist, and so experimentation is part of how I operate. You never know what you can do until you try it. And so we're looking for ideas, we're looking for information, we're looking for thoughts, how we can do things differently, how we can do things better. And I am very, very looking forward to the upcoming 2025-2026 season. So thank you for participating tonight, and thank you, Michael, for doing an outstanding moderating job.
This is Agenda Alexandria, a nonpartisan organization that takes a look at the issues without taking sides. Whether it's the city's sewer system, education, public safety, climate change, or perhaps a look back into Alexandria's history, Agenda Alexandria is here to shine a light. What makes the organization so successful is our people. The people who run it, our panelists, our moderators, and of course, our members. Agenda Alexandria is a member-funded organization, and we invite you to become one today by visiting agendaalexandria.org.